My name is Layla Wood, a lieutenant colonel and C-130 pilot in the United States Navy. 3 days ago, I flew a plane through a Category 4 hurricane to save 3 lives. Today, I am standing in a cold room that stinks of disinfectant and fear. Opposite me, Admiral William Maxwell throws my flight jacket onto the table. 42 years old, Lieutenant Colonel. His voice is ice-sharp. And you still act like an impulsive teenager. Your father had the same compassion, and it ended his career. You think you're special? He stands up, his face inches from mine. You are not a hero. You are a disgrace. Heroism doesn't feed logistics. You just threw away your wings. He thinks he's broken me, just like he broke my father. But he doesn't know one thing. The man I saved that night is about to become his worst nightmare. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been crushed by someone in power just for doing the right thing. The cockpit of a C-130 isn't built for comfort. It's built for work. And in a Category 4 hurricane, that work is hell. We were operating out of Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida. The base was on high alert, the wind already screaming over the massive hangars like a living thing. My aircraft, call sign, The Rock, was rattling so hard I could feel the vibrations in my teeth. The air was thick with the smell of damp metal and ozone. This wasn't a normal storm. This was a monster trying to swallow us whole. The yoke bucked in my hands, slick with sweat. Every rivet in the fuselage was groaning, a high-pitched metal shriek that sounded terrifyingly close to tearing. Altitude holding, barely, my co-pilot muttered, his knuckles white on his own controls. Through my headset, I could hear my crew chief, Anderson, muttering a prayer in the cargo bay. Anderson was old school. He'd been working on these birds since before I'd pinned on my ensign bars. If he was praying, we were in trouble. We were on a routine transport run, or what passed for routine when you were flying the edge of a hurricane. The mission was simple: get from point A to point B without getting ripped out of the sky. Then, the voice of Admiral William Maxwell cut through the static. His voice was the opposite of the storm. It was cold, absolute, and had all the humanity of a block of steel. All squadrons maintain heading. This is a hard deck mission. Any deviation from the secure flight corridor will be considered a gross violation of Order 304. Is that clear? It was clear. Order 304 was written in stone. In a declared emergency, Navy assets are to be preserved above all else. No exceptions. No compassion. Maxwell was a man who believed rules were the only thing separating civilization from chaos. He didn't just enforce the rules, he was the rules. And right as his voice faded, something impossible popped up on my secondary screen. A faint, civilian SOS signal. A single blinking red dot far below us, way outside the approved corridor, in the worst of the storm's eye wall. A civilian frequency, pleading. My blood went cold. I stared at the dot. Following it meant violating a direct order from the base commander. It meant flying into the deadliest part of the storm. It meant the end of my career. My co-pilot saw it too. His face went pale. Ma'am, we can't. That's a death sentence, for them and for us. I knew he was right. I knew what Maxwell said. But then, another voice echoed in my head. A voice from 25 years ago, standing in the rain. My father's voice, the day he was stripped of his rank. There are moments when you follow orders, Layla, he'd told me, his eyes steady even as his life was falling apart. And there are moments when you follow what's right. Don't ever let them take your compass. I hit the switch for the squadron command channel. Command, this is Rock 39er. I am picking up a civilian SOS. I am considering a diversion to render aid. The response was immediate, but it wasn't from command. It was from my rival, Lieutenant Colonel Reaper Jensen, flying somewhere else in the blackness. His voice was slick with contempt. Command, be advised, Wood's getting emotional again. I could hear the smirk in his voice. Be careful she doesn't wash out like her dad did. That was it, the reference to my father. The casual, cruel betrayal from a man I considered a brother in arms. Rage, cold and clear, cut through my fear. I ground my teeth and hit the switch, cutting the main channel. The cockpit went silent, save for the screaming wind. "Anderson," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Prep the cargo bay for an emergency landing. We're going fishing. Kill the comms." "Ma'am," my co-pilot whispered, his eyes wide. "You heard me," I snapped. "This is my command. I am diverting." I turned the plane, fighting the monster. I was betting my entire 20-year career on that single, blinking red dot. Landing a C-130 on a flooded 2-lane access road in 140 mph winds is not something they teach you in flight school. It's a controlled crash. Our landing lights cut through the solid curtain of rain, illuminating a scene from a nightmare. An overturned SUV, half submerged in the churning brown floodwater. A woman, the mother, was clinging to the roof, screaming. "The old man's still inside," she shrieked, pointing at the vehicle. I vaulted out of the crew hatch, Anderson right behind me. The wind and rain hit me like a physical blow. The 3-degree cold, that biting, wet Florida cold, slapped my face and soaked my flight suit instantly. I waded through the waist-deep, debris-filled water. The SUV was pinned against a downed oak tree. "Ma'am, he's not moving!" Anderson yelled, prying the door open. The old man on the back seat was blue. His eyes were open, vacant. I grabbed his wrist. No pulse. He was coding. "Get him out, now!" We dragged him from the car, his body limp. We got him onto a small patch of grass, which was really just a sea of mud. The mother was hysterical. "He's dead, isn't he? Oh God, he's dead!" "Not yet," I roared over the wind. I ripped open the man's shirt. My flight suit was covered in mud and God knows what else from the floodwater. I didn't care. I placed my hands on his sternum and started compressions. 1, 2, 3. I was screaming the count, trying to be heard over the storm. The rain was so thick I could barely see his face. 4, 5, 6. Nothing. He was gone. The family I belonged to, the Navy, would court-martial me for this. I had violated Order 304. I had lost a $60 million aircraft for a man who was already dead. Jensen's voice echoed in my ears. Emotional. 7, 8, 9. Anger surged through me. Anger at Maxwell. Anger at Jensen. Anger at this old man for daring to die on me. Breathe, damn it. I slammed my hands down again, pushing with all my weight. "You are not dying. Do you hear me? You are not dying." On the next compression, he coughed, a violent, choking gasp that spat muddy water onto my face. His eyes, which had been vacant, flew open in terror. He was back. We got him, the mother, and a third passenger, a child, into the cargo bay. I didn't say a word to my crew as I climbed back into the pilot's seat. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from adrenaline and rage. I taxied the Rock back onto the tarmac at Pensacola an hour later. The storm was still raging. As the engine spooled down, I saw my crew chief, Anderson, waiting for me on the rain-swept concrete. He was standing under a floodlight, and I could see the look on his face clearly. It wasn't relief. It was fear. And he was holding a piece of paper, a summons. The summons Anderson handed me on the tarmac was cold and damp from the rain. It didn't need to be. The chill came from the words on it. 80800. Admiral Maxwell's office. No escort. That last part was the knife. No escort. This wasn't a debrief. This was an execution. The next morning, I stood outside his office. The storm had passed, leaving behind that bright, sterile, humid air that always follows a hurricane in Florida. Maxwell's outer office was freezing. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the air conditioner, a mechanical drone that got inside my head. His secretary, a woman I'd known for 10 years, wouldn't meet my eyes. "He's waiting, ma'am." I walked in. The room was just as cold. Admiral Maxwell wasn't sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. He was standing in the middle of the room, waiting for me, his hands clasped behind his back. He was violating my personal space on purpose, a classic intimidation tactic. He let the silence stretch, forcing me to speak first. Sir, you wanted to see me. He stepped closer, his eyes like polished stones. Your father was a failure, Wood. A man who let his feelings override his oath, and you are walking the exact same path. I stood rigid, my eyes locked on the wall behind him. Sir, with all due respect, I saved 3 lives. You saved nothing, he was suddenly shouting, his face inches from mine. You violated a direct order, endangered a $60 million asset, and exposed your crew to unacceptable risk, all for a feeling. He jabbed his finger hard into my chest, right over my name tag. I will not let the sentimental, pathological compassion of your family line infect this base. You are suspended, effective immediately. I should have felt shock. I should have felt anger. But all I felt was a cold, familiar emptiness. The floor had just dropped out from under me. But that's not all, he said, his voice dropping to a low, satisfied hiss. He stepped back and pointed to my chest. Give them to me. Sir? Your wings, Lieutenant Colonel. Give them to me. Now! This was a new level of cruelty. Flight wings are earned. They are part of you. You don't just take them. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was pure, distilled rage. I slowly reached up, my fingers fumbling with the pin. I unclasped them, the gold aviator wings I'd earned 20 years ago, and placed them in his outstretched palm. He looked at them. Then he looked at me, and his lips curled into a smile of pure contempt. You'll report to Building 7, Logistics. Your off-flight status indefinitely. He tossed my wings onto his desk as if they were trash. Go count socks and underwear, Lieutenant Colonel. That's your level now. My first day in hell was hot. Building 7 was a giant windowless metal warehouse that smelled of dust, old canvas, and processed food. In the Florida heat, it was an oven. I, a C-130 pilot with 10,000 flight hours, a combat veteran, a lieutenant colonel, was handed a gray plastic barcode scanner. My job was to conduct an inventory of MREs, meals ready to eat. I scanned a box. Beep. Beef stew, 24 units. I scanned another. Beep. Chili mac, 24 units. The logistics personnel, mostly young enlisted sailors, watched me. They didn't look at me with respect. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and raw fear. I was radioactive. I was the officer who had crossed the Admiral. Talking to me could end their careers. So they just stared, then went back to their forklifts, leaving me alone in the oppressive heat with the endless, mindless beep of the scanner. Beep. This is what a 20-year career sounds like when it dies. Beep. This is the sound of your family throwing you in the garbage. The worst part, the part that still makes my stomach clench, came at noon. The mess hall. I had to eat. I was still a human being. I walked into the squadron mess. It was loud, the familiar, comforting chaos of 100 pilots yelling, laughing, and scraping forks on plates. I stepped through the door, and the sound stopped. It didn't fade. It stopped, like someone hit a mute button. 100 conversations died mid-word. The clatter of knives and forks ceased. 50 pilots, 50 men I'd flown with, trained with, celebrated with, 50 men I called my brothers. Every single one of them looked up, saw me, and then looked away. They looked at their food. They looked at the walls. They looked anywhere but at me. The silence was deafening, broken only by a single, low snicker. Reaper, Jensen, and his table. They were staring right at me, smiling. I held my head high. I would not let them see me break. I grabbed a tray, my hands numb. I got my food, paid the cashier, and started walking toward an empty table in the corner. I had to walk past Jensen's group. As I passed, a pilot sitting with him, a young lieutenant I'd recently signed off on his C-130 certification, accidentally slipped. His entire tray of spaghetti flipped into the aisle, right at my feet. A spray of hot, pulpy red sauce and noodles splattered across my boots and the cuff of my uniform. "Whoa, my mistake, Lieutenant Colonel," the pilot said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. Jensen and his buddies erupted in laughter. I froze. I looked down at the mess on my boots. I looked up at the pilot, who was still smirking. Not one person said a word. Not one officer in that entire room stood up. Not one brother told him to clean up his mess. They just watched. I said nothing. I just stepped over the spaghetti and continued to my empty table. I sat down, in the suffocating silence, and I ate my lunch. It's a terrible feeling, isn't it? Being made to feel invisible by the very people you thought were your family. Being the one everyone whispers about, but no one will talk to. If you've ever felt that chill run down your spine, if you know what it's like to be the outcast in the room, please support this story by hitting like and just comment the word invisible below. Let me know I'm not the only one. That night, I was in my empty base quarters when I desperately searched for my father's old, dog-eared King James Bible. I don't know what I was looking for. Absolution? An answer? I just needed to touch something that was his. My fingers found a verse he had underlined in John chapter 15. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. It didn't bring comfort, not really. It just brought a cold, sharp sense of history. This wasn't new. This loneliness was ancient. A knock at my door startled me. It was late, after 2200. It was Anderson, my crew chief. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around the empty parking lot as if Maxwell himself might be hiding in the shadows. "Ma'am," he whispered, not even stepping inside. "You need to be careful. They're trying to bury you." "What do you mean, Anderson? He's already grounded me." "It's worse than that," he said, his voice low. "I heard from a friend in admin. Maxwell has formally requested your medical file. He's going after your psych evals. He's trying to build a case that you're unstable." My blood ran cold. That was the final nail. If he got me on a medical discharge, nothing I said would ever matter. I'd be officially labeled crazy. "Thank you, Anderson. You're risking a lot by being here." "Your father was a good man, ma'am. He didn't deserve what they did to him." He pressed a small dark wooden box into my hand. It was old, with brass-reinforced corners. This was his. I've been holding on to it for him. For you. Maybe there's something in here you need to see. He was gone before I could even say thank you. I closed the door, the small wooden box heavy in my hand. I looked from the box to the wall, where an old framed photo hung. It was my father, 25 years younger, smiling, in his own flight suit. I touched the cold glass. "Dad," I whispered, and my voice finally broke. "I'm making the exact same mistake you did." I sat on the edge of my simple bed in my base housing quarters, the small wooden box from Anderson heavy on my lap. The room was sterile, impersonal. White walls, government-issue furniture. The only thing that was mine was the framed photo of my father on the nightstand. My fingers traced the brass clasps on the box. They were stiff, clicking open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. I lifted the lid. The smell hit me first. A powerful, familiar scent of mothballs, old leather, and cedar. The smell of a life packed away. Inside, resting on dark velvet, were 3 items. First, my father's own aviator wings. They were tarnished, the gold finish worn down to the metal in spots. They looked nothing like the shiny, perfect ones Maxwell had tossed on his desk. These looked used, worn, respected. Second, a photograph. It wasn't the formal portrait I had. This was a candid shot from the 1970s. My father, young, leaning against the nose of an F-4 Phantom, that iconic, shark-toothed grin on his face. He looked invincible. He looked happy. And third, beneath the photo, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp of the Navy Eagle, now cracked with age. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges. My blood turned to ice as I read the addressee, written in my father's precise, angular handwriting. Rear Admiral William Maxwell, personal and urgent. My breath caught. Anderson hadn't just given me a box of memories, he had given me a weapon. The name Maxwell was a key. Unlocking a door in my mind I kept bolted shut. The sterile quiet of my room faded, replaced by the sound of a cold, driving rain. A rain from 25 years ago. I was 17. I was standing across the street from the court-martial building, my cheap umbrella threatening to turn inside out. My mother stood beside me, perfectly still, her face pale. The doors opened and my father, Colonel Robert Wood, walked out. He wasn't in his dress whites. He was in his simple khaki service uniform, carrying his cover in his hand. He hadn't been crying. He wasn't angry. He just looked tired. His crime was an act of humanity. During a patrol in the South China Sea, long after the war, he had broken formation. He had defied a direct, do not engage order to rescue a sinking, overloaded boat of Vietnamese refugees. He saved 82 people the rest of the fleet had been ordered to pretend they didn't see. And for that, the Navy took everything. He walked toward us, his steps heavy in the rain. I watched as the other Navy wives, women who had been at our house for barbecues, women my mother had served coffee with for a decade, hurried out of the building. They saw my mother. They saw us. And I watched them grab their children's hands, pulling them to the other side of the street to avoid us. It was the same chill. The same sudden invisibility. The exact same suffocating silence I had just felt in the mess hall. I realized, standing there in my room, I wasn't just making my father's mistake. I was reliving his punishment. He reached us. He didn't say anything to my mother. He just looked at me, his 17-year-old daughter who had told him just a week before that she was applying to the Naval Academy. He slowly reached up to his collar. He unpinned his full-bird colonel's eagles. Then, he unclipped the heavy star-adorned shoulder boards from his uniform. He pressed them into my hand. They were still warm. "Don't ever let them take your compass, Layla," he said, his voice quiet but rough. "What?" I whispered, confused. He tapped his finger against my chest, right over my heart. "The compass. It's in here. It's the only thing that guides you when all the maps are wrong. Don't you ever let them take it." He was court-martialed for compassion. And now, 25 years later, Maxwell was trying to bury me for the exact same thing. My hands were shaking as I broke the wax seal on the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. It was my father's personal stationery. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning. I read the first line. "Will." My heart stopped. Not Admiral, not Sir. "Will." "Will, you and I both know the rules are written in blood. We flew together in the Gulf of Tonkin. I've seen you be a good man, a man who knows the difference between protocol and morality. But the system is changing us. We are creating a generation of officers who are more afraid of doing the right thing than they are of doing the wrong thing. The men I answered to, they wanted a perfect record. Those refugees were an imperfection. They didn't fit the narrative. You are presiding over my trial, and I know you will do what the system demands. You will break me. But I'm telling you, as a man I once respected, a Navy that punishes compassion will one day lose its soul. Don't let them turn you into a brass monster. Robert." I read the letter again, and again. I went numb. Maxwell didn't just know my father. They weren't just colleagues, they were friends. Will. They had flown combat together. I felt a cold, sick realization creep up my spine. I remembered the promotion announcements from years ago. Maxwell's career had taken off, a rocket-like trajectory, right after my father's court-martial. The scandal had been contained. The man who contained it, the man who did what the system demanded and broke his friend, had been rewarded for it. He didn't just enforce the rules. He benefited from my father's destruction. The deep, heavy sadness I had felt for my father, the profound sense of loss, began to curdle. It turned into something else. It sharpened. It became a cold, hard, precise anger. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't history repeating itself by accident. This was a pattern. Maxwell hadn't just slandered me in that office. He was finishing the job he started 25 years ago, erasing the legacy of compassion that Robert Wood represented. I looked down at the letter. My father's dye vat. His ghost. This wasn't just a memory. This was evidence. I folded the letter, my hands perfectly steady now. The sadness was gone, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in days. I knew exactly what I had to do. My father's letter wasn't a memory. It was a map. And it pointed directly to the one person in Pensacola who might hate William Maxwell more than I did. His daughter. A quick search on my phone confirmed it. Dr. Evelyn Maxwell, an emergency room physician at Sacred Heart Hospital. The articles noted she was estranged from her father. I've spent my entire adult life in a uniform. My flight suit, my dress whites, even my khakis. They are my armor. They tell people who I am. But to walk into a civilian hospital, to approach the Admiral's daughter, I couldn't be Lieutenant Colonel Wood. The uniform would be a wall. So I changed into a pair of worn blue jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. I felt naked. Stripped of my rank and my wings, I was just a 42-year-old woman walking into the unknown. Sacred Heart's emergency room was the opposite of my world. My world was procedure, order, and checklists. This was pure, unadulterated human chaos. The waiting room was packed. The air hummed with the sound of daytime TV, a baby crying, and the constant hacking cough of an old man in the corner. The smell of industrial-strength disinfectant couldn't cover the underlying scent of sickness and fear. I, a pilot who controls a 100,000-pound aircraft in a hurricane, was now completely powerless. I was just another number waiting to be called. I sat for 2 hours, my father's letter feeling like a block of ice in my purse. "Dr. Maxwell?" I finally asked a nurse at the triage desk. The nurse gave me a weary look. "She's on hour 30 of a 36-hour shift, honey. It's a war zone back there. What's this about?" "It's personal. About her father." The nurse's face hardened. "I'll see if she'll come out. Don't get your hopes up." Another hour passed. I was about to give up when the double doors flew open and a woman in sweat-stained blue scrubs stormed out. She looked like she'd been through a battle. Her hair was matted and her face was a mask of pure exhaustion and irritation. This was Evelyn Maxwell. She didn't even look at me. She was staring at her chart. "I was told you had a message about my father. You have 5 minutes. I have a guy in bed 4 with a heart attack." I stood up. "Dr. Maxwell, my name is Layla Wood." She stopped. Her head snapped up. The exhaustion in her eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, and intelligent hostility. She crossed her arms, a perfect defensive barrier. "Wood, the pilot, the one who rescued my grandparents." I was stunned. "You know who they are." "Of course I know," she snapped. "So, what is this? You're here for a reward? A medal? Or are you here to blackmail my father? Did he not offer you enough hush money to make this go away?" Her words were like bullets, and they hit just as hard. Her hostility was a wall, just as cold and silent as the one in the mess hall. My first instinct was to flinch, to retreat. But I wasn't just here for me. I was here for my father. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I just reached into my purse, pulled out the yellowed 25-year-old envelope, and held it out. "I'm not here for money, doctor." Her eyes flickered down to the envelope, to the official Navy seal, to my father's handwriting. She didn't take it. "My father," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "wrote this letter to your father 25 years ago. He never sent it. My father tried to save your father's soul. Now I'm just trying to save myself." Evelyn stared at the letter. She saw the addressee, Rear Admiral William Maxwell. Her hand, which had been clenched at her side, began to tremble. Just a little. She snatched the letter from my grasp. She broke the seal. It was already broken, but she tore it open. Her eyes flew across the page, scanning the words my father had written a quarter-century ago. I watched her face. It was like watching a dam crack. The hard, angry, exhausted mask of the ER doctor began to crumble. She read it a second time, slower. She got to the part about the brass monster. Her hand flew to her mouth. She looked up at me, and her eyes, which had been so cold, were now wide and swimming in tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. It was a choked, broken sound. He knew. All those years ago. He knew what he was. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Come with me, not here." She pulled me through the double doors, past the trauma bays, and into a tiny windowless office that smelled of stale coffee and bleach. She slumped into her desk chair and stared at the letter. "The brass monster," she said, her voice shaking. That's what my mother used to call him. After he made her cry, she said the Navy had turned him into a brass monster. She looked up at me, and all the hostility was gone, replaced by a shared, bitter understanding. "The people you saved, Layla," she said. "The old man whose life you saved. That's my grandfather. My mother's father." I was confused. "But then why would your father be punishing me? I saved his family." Evelyn let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You don't get it. He's punishing you because you saved them. My father, Admiral Maxwell. He hates them. He's ashamed of them." "Ashamed? But why?" "Because they're civilians." She spat the word like it was poison. "My mother married down. My grandfather wasn't an officer. He was a shrimp boat captain from Biloxi. My grandmother was a waitress. They're just normal working-class people. And my father is a pathological snob who cannot stand that he is related by marriage to people he thinks are common." It all clicked into place. The rage, the personal nature of the attack. "He hasn't spoken a civil word to them in 5 years," Evelyn continued, the words pouring out of her. "He's angry you saved them because it embarrasses him. It drags his common family into the spotlight. He's an arrogant, petty, and cruel man." She finally, truly, looked at me. "My father wasn't always like this. I have memories. He was a dad once, a long time ago. And then he became an admiral, and he chose the uniform over his family again and again until he had no family left." I wasn't looking at the admiral's daughter anymore. I was looking at another survivor. Another woman whose life had been fractured by the same man. We were a two-person, found family, united by the same ghost. Evelyn stood up, her exhaustion burned away by a sudden, cold fury that I recognized. It was the same fury I felt. "He's not just burying you, Layla," she said. "He's burying his own past. He's burying my mother's memory, and I will not let him do it." She looked at her computer. "Maxwell has requested your medical file. I know because my friends at Navy Medical flagged it for me. He's trying to build a case that you're unstable." "He's trying to have me medically discharged," I whispered, the full weight of Anderson's warning hitting me. "Worse," Evelyn said. "He's organizing a public hearing, a formal review board. He doesn't want to just discharge you, he wants to discredit you. He wants to stand up in front of your peers and label you mentally unfit. It's not a hearing, Layla. It's a show trial." The summons, the cold room, the humiliation. It was all a prelude. "He thinks he's beaten you," Evelyn said, her eyes flashing. "He thinks he's beaten me, but he just made one mistake." "What's that?" "He made us find each other. We have to act, and we have to act fast, before that hearing." Evelyn's warning came too late. The hearing was scheduled for the next day. 0900. It wasn't a hearing, it was a public execution. The base auditorium was packed. It was a mandatory training event. Every officer in Pensacola who wasn't currently in the air was there, a sea of white and khaki uniforms. The air was thick and cold, not from the air conditioning, but with palpable fear. I saw them all. The pilots from the mess hall who had turned their backs. The young officers who looked at me with pity. The senior officers who looked at me with cold judgment. This was Maxwell's message, delivered to the entire base. This is what happens when you cross me. I sat alone at a small bare table in the center of the floor. There was no defense counsel. There was no jury of my peers. There was only me and the stage. Admiral William Maxwell sat on a high dais, elevated above everyone like a king on a throne. A single gavel rested on the podium in front of him. He looked out at the silent crowd, his face a mask of stern, righteous authority. We are gathered, his voice boomed over the speakers, to review a serious breach of conduct, a failure of discipline that not only endangered a $60 million asset, but threatened the very integrity of our command structure. He looked down at me, his eyes devoid of any emotion. This is not a trial. The facts are not in dispute. This is a formal review of the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Layla Wood. He began by reading the official report, his voice cold and monotone. He referred to the people I saved as 3 unidentified civilians. He knew exactly who they were. He knew I had saved his own family. He was lying by omission, erasing his personal shame from the official record. I could feel Evelyn, somewhere in the back rows, seething. To understand the full scope of this failure, Maxwell continued, I call Lieutenant Colonel Reaper Jensen to the stand. My stomach tightened. Jensen strode onto the stage, immaculate in his dress-white uniform, looking like the Navy's recruiting poster. He stood at the podium, radiating a smooth, smug confidence. Lieutenant Colonel Jensen, Maxwell said, you were in the air during the event. Can you describe Lieutenant Colonel Wood's demeanor? Jensen nodded, his face a perfect picture of reluctant concern. With all due respect, Admiral, she was erratic. A murmur went through the crowd. She was shouting over the comms, Jensen said, his voice smooth as oil. She seemed highly emotional. When command denied her request to divert, she simply stopped responding. It was my assessment that she panicked. Liar. My hands, resting on the table, clenched into white-knuckled fists. I stared at the wood grain, digging my nails into my palms. She was feeling something, Jensen continued, putting a slight, derogatory emphasis on the word. It was unpredictable. In my opinion, sir, her emotional state compromised the entire crew. He was using the oldest attacks in the book. He was painting me as a hysterical woman, incapable of handling pressure. He was telling a room full of male pilots that I was exactly what they feared. Emotional. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, judging me, believing him. I had flown 10,000 hours. I had landed a C-130 with 2 engines out in a sandstorm. And this man, this weasel, was dismissing me as emotional in front of my entire world. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel, Maxwell said, dismissing him. Jensen walked off the stage, shooting me a tiny, triumphant smirk as he passed. Maxwell picked up a sheet of paper. The charges are as follows. Willful disregard for a direct order, Article 92. Gross negligence and endangerment of a $60 million naval asset. Dereliction of duty. He put the paper down and leaned into the microphone. You did all of this, he said, his voice dropping, for a feeling. A feeling that you, a lieutenant colonel, decided was more important than the discipline of the United States Navy. He paused, letting the silence hang. Then, he delivered the killing blow. I have reviewed your record, Lieutenant Colonel. It is adequate. But it shows a disturbing pattern, a tendency to question, a tendency to prioritize emotion over order. He looked directly at me, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall. Your discipline is lax, Lieutenant Colonel, just like your father's. There it was, the public shaming, the connection. He wasn't just firing me, he was branding me as the failed daughter of a failed officer. He was executing my career and my father's legacy at the same time. The humiliation was a physical thing. It was hot and it rose up my neck, burning my face. I could feel the stares. I could feel the whispers. I refused to look down. I refused to cry. I would not give him the satisfaction. I remembered my father's words, standing in the rain, 25 years ago. Don't ever let them take your compass, Layla. It's in here. It's the only thing that guides you when all the maps are wrong. They could take my wings. They could take my career. They could humiliate me, but they could not touch that. My compass was my own. My spine straightened. The heat in my face cooled. My hands unclenched. I was no longer angry. I was just clear. The calm I felt in the storm, it was back. Maxwell seemed to sense the shift. He was expecting tears. He was expecting me to break. My silence, my stillness. It angered him. Lieutenant Colonel Wood, do you have anything to say in defense of this disgraceful behavior? He was challenging me. He wanted me to argue, to yell, to be emotional, just as Jensen had claimed. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping loudly in the silent hall. I picked up my copy of the flight report and the SOS log. Admiral, I said, my voice perfectly level. I have the flight recorder data that contradicts Lieutenant Colonel Jensen's testimony, and I have the identities of the civilians who… Bang! The sound of his gavel was like a gunshot. Sit down! He roared. The entire room jumped. You are here to answer, Lieutenant Colonel, not to ask questions. You are not here to present evidence. He was furious, his mask of control slipping. We are not here to listen to your excuses. Your record is clear. Your insubordination is clear. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed. You are a liability, Lieutenant Colonel Wood, a burden on this organization. He leaned back, visibly composing himself. He straightened his uniform. This review is concluded, he said, his voice returning to its cold steel tone. He looked down at me, one last time, with utter disdain. Do you have anything else to say, Lieutenant Colonel? I met his gaze. I looked at this man who had destroyed my father and was now destroying me. I looked at the brass monster my father had warned me about. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my father's letter in his face, but I didn't. I held his gaze. No, Admiral. He nodded, satisfied. He had won. He had silenced me. He turned to address the crowd, to deliver his closing remarks. He didn't hear what I whispered, so low that only I could hear it. But I will not be silent. I walked out of the auditorium. I don't remember the steps. I don't remember the fresh, humid Florida air hitting my face. I just remember the silence in my head, a complete, roaring void where my thoughts used to be. The compass my father gave me was still there, but I was adrift in an endless, empty ocean. I got back to my base housing quarters, the small beige duplex that had been my home for 6 years. My front door was open. A junior officer, a young ensign I didn't recognize, was standing there, holding a large manila envelope. He looked about 19. He couldn't meet my eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Wood, he stammered. Yes, Ensign. I am directed to deliver this to you, ma'am, by hand. He held out the envelope. It was from the Admiral's office. Thank you, Ensign, I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. He practically ran down the walkway. I closed the door. The house was empty. I'd already started packing, boxing up my life in preparation for the inevitable. The living room was an echo chamber of cardboard and tape. I sat on a sealed box labeled Kitchen Mugs. I opened the envelope. It wasn't a long letter. It was a single page, a form letter. But the words, cold and bureaucratic, jumped out at me. Effective immediately. Involuntary discharge under medical review. Psychological evaluation. Mentally unstable. The air left my lungs. This was the final move. The checkmate. He hadn't just humiliated me. He hadn't just fired me. He was having me discharged for being crazy. The word unstable danced in front of my eyes. It was the medical review Anderson had warned me about. It was the panic Jensen had testified to. They had built their case. This was the final, vicious, calculated blow. It was designed to permanently silence me. Because now, anything I said, any accusation, any letter from my father, any proof I had, would be dismissed. It would be the ramblings of a mentally unstable officer who couldn't handle the pressure. He wasn't just killing my career. He was erasing my credibility. He was erasing me. That was the last straw. That was the one blow I couldn't parry. The envelope slipped from my fingers. I slid off the box and onto the floor, my back against the wall. The silence in the empty house was terrifying. 20 years I had given the Navy. It was my church. It was my family. It was the only thing I knew. I had missed weddings, funerals, birthdays, all in service of the uniform. And they were throwing me away. Not just throwing me away, but labeling me as damaged goods. as trash. I reached into the small box of personal items I hadn't packed and pulled out my father's tarnished aviator wings. I clutched them in my hand, the metal digging into my palm. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I cried. I didn't just weep, I sobbed. It wasn't the hot, sharp cry of anger I'd felt in the hearing. It was the deep, gut-wrenching, ugly cry of complete and total exhaustion. The system had won. It had beaten my father, and now, 25 years later, it had finally, truly, beaten me. I had fought, I had held my head high, I had clutched my compass, and it didn't matter. They had taken everything anyway. I cried for my father. I cried for the 17-year-old girl standing in the rain, believing she could make a difference. I cried for the 42-year-old woman sitting on the floor, holding the remnants of a life that was now over. I cried for the rot, for the corruption, for the fact that men like Jensen and Maxwell win. I don't know how long I sat there, just empty. Drained. Finished. In the corner, the old television I'd moved into the living room was still on, the volume low. I'd had it on for background noise to make the empty house feel less dead. It was playing a local news segment, a look-back piece. I wasn't really watching until I heard a name that cut through the fog. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, the news anchor said. I looked up. My eyes were swollen. On the screen was footage from years ago, the miracle on the Hudson. The U.S. Airways plane, floating in the icy water. Sully saved all 155 souls on board, the anchor said. But what many don't remember is the intense investigation that followed. They showed a graphic. They were talking about the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. Sully faced, the anchor continued, an aggressive inquiry that suggested he could have made it back to the airport. They grilled him. They ran simulations trying to prove he was wrong. My tears stopped. I stared at the screen. They grilled him. They tried to prove him wrong. A man who pulled off a one-in-a-million miracle. A hero. The bureaucracy, the men at the desks, their first instinct was to second-guess him, to find a flaw, to blame the pilot. They did it to him, too. I slowly got to my feet. The despair, the exhaustion. It was still there. But something new was mixing with it. It was a spark, a tiny hot ember of pure, unadulterated rage. They did it to Sully. They did it to my father. And now they were doing it to me. This is what they do. The system doesn't protect heroes. It protects itself. My father's mistake wasn't compassion. His mistake was losing. My mistake wasn't breaking the rules. My mistake was thinking I could fight them alone. My entire focus shifted. This was no longer about saving my career. My career was dead. That single sheet of paper had killed it. This was now about one thing: burning the whole rotten system down. This was about the truth. This was about my father. It was about Evelyn's family. It was about the anonymous fisherman Maxwell had let die 2 years ago. This was about justice, whatever the cost. Have you ever been pushed so far that you had to stop crying and start fighting? Let me know in the comments if you know that feeling, and hit that like button if you're ready for me to fight back. The anger brought clarity. I walked into the kitchen, my steps steady. I'd been so focused on defending myself inside the Navy, I'd forgotten about the world outside it. On my counter, under a stack of mail, was a small pile of business cards. One was from a reporter at the Pensacola News-Journal. He had tried to contact me after the rescue. At the time, I'd ignored him, as per regulations. I picked up the card. Mark Stevens, investigative reporter. I looked at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. I didn't care. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number. It rang 3 times, and a sleepy, gravelly voice answered. Stevens. Mr. Stevens, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Layla Wood. There was a pause. I heard him sit up in bed. Colonel, I've been trying to reach you. I have a story for you, Mark, I said, my voice cold and clear. And I have proof. I have proof that Admiral William Maxwell is covering up the truth about the rescue. I have proof that he is lying to destroy my career, just like he did to my father 25 years ago. The phone call with Mark Stevens was short and direct. I was no longer a victim asking for help. I was a source, offering a kill shot. A Waffle House, he'd said, his voice gravelly. The one on I-10. 1 hour, come alone. I drove my beat-up civilian truck, not my government-issued car. The Waffle House was an island of fluorescent light in the pre-dawn darkness, a classic 24/7 Southern landmark. I walked in, the smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon hitting me. It was a world away from the sterile, cold precision of the Navy. Mark was in a back booth, exactly like you'd picture an old-school local reporter. He was in his late 50s, with a crumpled shirt, tired eyes, and a notepad that looked like it had been through a war. I slid into the booth. A waitress came over. "Coffee," I said. "Black." "Same," Mark grunted. He looked at me, his eyes skeptical. "So, you're the pilot. You know how many calls I get from disgruntled personnel, Colonel? Most of them are just noise." "Was my father's case noise, Mr. Stevens?" His eyes sharpened. I slid my father's 25-year-old letter across the table. "He wrote this to Maxwell. He never sent it." Mark picked it up. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower. He looked up, and the skepticism was gone. "My God," he whispered. "I covered your father's court-martial. I was just a cub reporter. They buried him, Colonel. They fed us a line about insubordination, but it always smelled wrong. He's doing it again, Mark, to me. He held a public hearing and branded me unstable. I have the discharge papers to prove it. He's trying to silence me." "Why?" Mark asked. "Why you? Why this rescue?" "That's where it gets personal," I said. "I need you to meet someone." I called Evelyn. We met an hour later, the three of us in the most secure place I could think of. My parked truck in the empty lot of a closed-down strip mall. The only light came from a single, buzzing overhead lamp. "This is Dr. Evelyn Maxwell," I said, "the Admiral's daughter." Mark's eyes went wide. "And," I continued, "the granddaughter of the people I rescued." Mark just stared. "So, Maxwell is punishing you for saving his own family." "He's ashamed of them," Evelyn said, her voice tight with a lifetime of anger. "He sees them as common, as a slum family. He's punishing Layla because she exposed his secret." "That's a motive," Mark said. "But it's not enough. It's his word against yours. A she said between an admiral and his estranged daughter. We need something more." Evelyn's hands were trembling. "I have it," she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was old, the corners worn soft. "This was my mother's journal," she said. She opened it, her hands gentle. We read it together, using the light from my phone. It was heartbreaking. It wasn't a diary of events, but of emotions. It described the transformation of William Maxwell, the young, loving husband she married, and then, slowly, the officer obsessed with rank. The man who stopped coming to family dinners. The man who, in her words, became the brass monster. Then Evelyn found the page. October 14th. William was supposed to visit father. He's sick. Pneumonia. William refused. He said he couldn't be seen parking his Admiral's car in a slum. He's ashamed. He's ashamed of my family. He's ashamed of me. My God, it wasn't just a theory. It was written right there. This wasn't about naval discipline. This was about a petty, cruel, personal hatred. Layla Wood hadn't just saved 3 civilians. She had saved the very people Admiral Maxwell despised. "This is the motive," Mark said, his voice low and intense. "This is the why. Now we need the how. We need the pattern." "What pattern?" I asked. "Your father, you. It can't just be you two. A man this ruthless, this obsessed with control, he's done this before." Mark looked at me. "He's a zero-defect commander, isn't he?" I nodded. "The base has a perfect operational record. No accidents, no failures. It's uncanny." "It's not uncanny," Mark said. "It's a cover-up. Zero defect doesn't mean perfect. It means hides his mistakes. Give me 48 hours. Mark went to work. He was a shark who'd just caught the scent of blood. He dug into base records, cross-referencing them with public logs and Coast Guard reports. 2 days later, we met again, back at the Waffle House. I found it, Mark said, his eyes gleaming. 2 years ago, a shrimp boat, the Jenny, sank in a squall 30 miles off the coast. One fisherman had a heart attack on the life raft. The Coast Guard was minutes away, but they didn't have the right medical gear. They issued an emergency medevac request to Pensacola. We have the helicopters for that, I said. We're the closest. Exactly, Mark said. The request went straight to Maxwell's desk. It was bad weather, a risk, the kind of risk you just took. What did he do? Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. He denied the request, Mark said. I have the log. He wrote weather conditions unfavorable, not worth the risk to naval assets. The fisherman died on the raft. Maxwell's decision. But it was logged as a civilian casualty, and his perfect operational record remained intact. It was horrifying. He had let a man die rather than risk a blemish on his perfect record. There's more, Mark said. He had found 3 other officers, all now retired or in the reserves, who had been crushed by Maxwell. One for a minor landing gear incident, another for a small fuel spill. All of them had their careers ended for a single, minor mistake. All of them had been encouraged to retire quietly to avoid public disgrace. We had it. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just my father. It was a pattern. A 25-year pattern of ruthless ambition, of personal cruelty, of covering up the truth, and of destroying anyone who was a threat. The 3 of us sat there, in the booth. The Alliance, Layla, the soldier, the target, Evelyn, the doctor, the family, the keeper of the secret weapon, Mark, the press, the Fourth Estate. We weren't just fighting for my career anymore. My career was already dead. We were fighting for my father, Colonel Robert Wood. We were fighting for Evelyn's mother and the slum family she loved. We were fighting for the dead fisherman on the Jenny. We were fighting for every other officer Maxwell had ground into dust to protect his perfect record. Mark looked at me. I have everything I need. The letter, the diary, the medevac log, the anonymous testimony from the other officers. This is a story. This is a big story. What now? I asked. Now, Mark said, pulling out his laptop. We load the bullet. He looked at Evelyn, then at me. Once I hit publish, all hell will break loose. You both need to be ready. The brass monster is about to wake up. Mark's plan was timed to the second. The all-hands meeting was mandatory. Maxwell had summoned all 1,000 officers on base to the main auditorium. He was a man who needed an audience for his executions. Mark, Evelyn, and I had a plan. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to be packed and gone by the time he announced my discharge. I was going to be there. I stood in the back, in uniform, my hands clasped behind my back. Maxwell took the stage. He stood at the high podium, basking in the sea of uniforms, the picture of absolute power. Good morning, his voice boomed, sharp and cold. We are here today to address a critical matter of discipline. This base, my base, operates on a zero-defect policy. There is no room for error. There is no room for weakness. He let the words hang. I could feel the fear in the room. This was his church, and he was the high priest. We demand perfection, he continued. And when an element proves to be unreliable, unstable, it must be purged. He held up a single piece of paper, my medical discharge. Today, we take that step. We purify our ranks. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Colonel Layla Wood. He never got to finish the sentence. It started with a single buzz, a phone in the front row vibrating on the table. Maxwell paused, glaring at the officer who quickly silenced it. Then another buzz, and another, and then 10. And then, like a swarm of angry hornets, the entire room, 1,000 phones in 1,000 pockets, began to vibrate. Beep, beep, beep. A ripple of confusion swept the auditorium. Officers looked down at their phones, their eyes widening. A whisper started, then grew. I saw a young lieutenant near me pull out his phone. His jaw dropped. He showed it to the man next to him. I could read the headline of the Pensacola News Journal, pushed to every phone in the zip code. Admiral Maxwell lied. Hero pilot discharged to hide family scandal. Silence! Maxwell roared into the microphone. Attention on deck. But no one was listening. They were reading. They were reading about my father. They were reading about the Jenny. They were reading excerpts from a private journal. Maxwell's face, which had been a mask of stone, began to crack. The color drained from it. He went from tan to gray in a heartbeat. I said, attention, he stammered. And that's when the main doors of the auditorium burst open. Bang! The heavy wooden doors slammed against the walls. Every head in the room turned. It was Evelyn. She wasn't in scrubs. She was in a simple black dress, her face pale but resolute. She strode down the center aisle, her heels clicking loudly in the stunned silence. Father, she shouted. Her voice, unamplified, was raw and powerful. Maxwell looked as if he'd been struck. Evelyn, what is the meaning of this? Remove this civilian. You lied, she yelled, pointing at him. The entire room turned back to Maxwell, then back to her. You stood on that stage and you lied. Security, Maxwell bellowed, his voice cracking. You lied about me, Evelyn cried. You lied about my mother. You lied about my grandparents, the people she saved. This is nonsense, Maxwell stammered, gripping the podium. This is the rambling of an unstable. The truth, Father. The truth you've been hiding for 25 years. The room was in chaos. Officers were on their feet, looking at the stage, at their phones, at Evelyn. And then they saw she wasn't alone. Evelyn had been pushing a wheelchair. In it sat a frail old man, bundled in a blanket, an oxygen tube clipped to his nose. It was her grandfather. The man I had pulled from the mud. The unidentified civilian. Maxwell's father-in-law. Evelyn pushed the wheelchair right to the foot of the stage. Tell them, Grandpa, she whispered. The old man looked at Maxwell. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. With a tremendous effort, he gripped the armrest of the wheelchair. He began to stand. He was shaking, wobbling, but he got his feet under him. He stood, frail and small, staring up at the Admiral. Maxwell was frozen. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Will, the old man said. His voice was a thin, reedy rasp, but in the dead silence, it carried like a cannon shot. Maxwell flinched. Will, the old man said again, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. I read the paper. I read what my daughter wrote about her mother. Sir, this is not the, Maxwell began. You let your pride, your damned black pride, you let it almost kill me, the old man rasped. You were ashamed of us, ashamed of your own family. That's a lie, Maxwell shrieked, his composure completely gone. And now, the old man said, ignoring him, you are letting that same pride destroy this woman. He turned slowly and looked across the floor to where I was standing in the back. He didn't know me. He'd been unconscious, but he knew. He pointed a shaky finger at me. Young lady, he called out, you are a hero. I felt the tears finally come, hot and fast. Then the old man turned back to the stage. He looked at the towering, decorated, powerful man on the dais, his son-in-law. He raised his finger one last time. And you, he said, his voice full of a lifetime of quiet disappointment. You are a coward. It was done. The word hung in the air. Coward. Admiral William Maxwell, the brass monster, the king on his throne. He didn't speak. He just deflated. He staggered back a step. He looked out at the 1,000 faces staring at him, faces that were no longer full of fear, but full of shock and contempt. He reached back blindly for the chair behind him. And he collapsed. He didn't faint. He just sank. A 60-year-old man, defeated, broken, and alone, in front of his entire world. The king was off his throne. The spell was broken. The aftermath of the all-hands meeting was not loud. It was a deafening corporate silence. The chaos of that morning gave way to a base holding its breath. Maxwell hadn't been arrested. He had simply vanished. He was escorted from the auditorium by two quiet, grim-faced officers from his own staff, and the base was left in a state of shock. Within 12 hours, a high-level investigation team from Washington, D.C. was on the ground. They weren't there to interview me. I had already given my statement to Mark. They were there to manage the fallout. The Pentagon, I realized, doesn't like scandals, but it hates losing. And Maxwell had just made the entire Navy look like a fool. The investigation was swift. Faced with the Pensacola News-Journal article, the logs from the Jenny incident, the sworn affidavits from other ruined officers, and, most damningly, his own wife's journal, William Maxwell was given the standard choice offered to disgraced flag officers: retire immediately, citing personal reasons, and keep your pension, or face a full public court-martial for conduct unbecoming, abuse of power, and dereliction of duty. He chose retirement. His disgrace was quiet, sanitized by a single press release that thanked him for his 38 years of service. The brass monster didn't go out with a bang. He was snuffed out like a candle. The atmosphere on base changed overnight. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, awkward energy. People who had avoided my gaze for weeks now nodded at me in the hallways. But the real test came 3 days later. I was back in the mess hall. My suspension was still technically in effect, but no one dared enforce it. I was sitting alone, eating a plate of eggs, when a shadow fell over my table. It was Reaper Jensen. He wasn't sneering. He was smiling. That slick, political smile that made my skin crawl. He was flanked by two other pilots from his crew. "Layla," he said, like we were old friends. He actually patted me on the shoulder. "That was just incredible. What you did. Pulling that off. We knew you had it in you." I just looked at his hand on my shoulder until he awkwardly removed it. "Anyway," he plunged on, "a bunch of us are getting together this weekend. A big BBQ over at my place. Celebrating the end of the reign of terror, you know? You gotta come. First round's on me." He was already turning to his friends, laughing, as if my acceptance was a given. I let the sound of the clinking forks in the hall fill the silence. Then I very deliberately set my own fork down on my plate. I looked straight into his eyes. They were the same eyes that had watched me with smug satisfaction in the Admiral's office. "The last time I saw you, Reaper," I said, my voice low and calm, "you were laughing while I was being publicly humiliated. The time before that, you were on an open channel testifying that I was emotional and panicked and a danger to my crew. The same crew I saved." His plastic smile froze. The pilots next to him stopped shuffling. "My career could have ended," I continued. "My life could have been ruined. And you were laughing." "Hey now, Layla, I was just..." He stammered. "I was just playing the game. You know how it is. You gotta..." "No," I said, cutting him off. The word was cold. "I don't know how it is, and I don't want to." I picked up my tray. "Don't ever speak to me again," I said. "You are not my friend." I stood up and walked away, leaving him and his crew standing there, finally, in the dead silence they deserved. I didn't look back. Setting that boundary felt harder and better than facing the storm. There was one last piece of closure I needed. I went to Maxwell's office. The nameplate was already gone. I found him inside, alone, packing cardboard boxes. He wasn't in uniform. This was the most shocking thing of all. Without the stars on his collar and the rows of ribbons, he was just an old man. A tired, defeated old man in a baggy gray suit, his shoulders slumped. The brass monster was gone. He didn't look up when I entered. "They took everything from me," he muttered, taping up a box. "My career, my honor, my family." I stood in the doorway. "No, sir," I said. He finally looked at me, his eyes hollow. "You didn't lose them," I said. "You threw them away." He stared at me, and for the first time, I didn't see hatred or contempt or arrogance. I saw regret. A deep, bottomless well of it. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." I knew he wouldn't. He was too broken for that. Instead, he walked over to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a single, yellowed envelope. The original. My father's letter. He held it out to me. "He was right," Maxwell whispered, his voice hoarse. I kept it. I read it, over and over. He looked at the letter, not at me. "Your father, Robert, he was a better officer than I am. A better man." He dropped the letter into my hand. "Don't let this system turn you into me, Wood," he said. And then he turned back to his boxes. I took the letter. I finally had it. The validation. The truth. It was a bittersweet victory. I had won, but the family I'd fought for was still broken. My restoration was quiet. The new Admiral, a stern-looking woman named Hayes, called me to her office a week later. There was no crowd, no reporters, just her, me, and Anderson, who had insisted on being there. "Lieutenant Colonel Wood," she said, her voice firm but fair. "On behalf of the United States Navy, I want to formally apologize. What was done to you and to your father was a failure of leadership." She didn't make excuses. She didn't hide behind regulations. She picked up a small velvet box from her desk, opened it, and pulled out a new, shining pair of gold flight wings. "The sky is waiting for you," she said as she pinned them firmly onto my chest, right where they belonged. I saluted. "Thank you, Admiral." She saluted back. "Welcome back, Lieutenant Colonel." She paused, then gave me a small, rare smile. "And one more thing," she said. "We need your compass. Admiral Hayes's last words to me. We need your compass. We're not just symbolic." 2 weeks later, I wasn't summoned to an admiral's office. I was invited to Washington, D.C. I flew to the Pentagon, not as a defendant, but as a consultant. I sat at a long, polished table with a panel of admirals and aviation policy writers. They were grim-faced, facing a PR nightmare, but they were also, for the first time, listening. Lieutenant Colonel Wood, the panel chair, a 4-star admiral, began. "We have read your report. We have read your father's letter, and we have read Admiral Maxwell's record. It's clear the system failed you. It failed your father. Our question is simple. How do we fix it?" I took a breath. This was it. This was the moment that mattered more than the storm, more than the hearing. "Admirals," I said, "the system didn't just fail us. We, the pilots, are failing the system. For 25 years, we've been operating under a doctrine of fear. We've created a generation of officers, as my father wrote, who are more afraid of doing the wrong thing than they are of doing the right thing." I pushed my father's letter across the table. My father was punished for compassion. I was nearly destroyed for it. Maxwell's zero-defect policy. That wasn't leadership, it was tyranny. It left no room for the human element. "What are you proposing, Colonel?" the chair asked. "I'm proposing a new doctrine," I said, my voice steady. "I'm proposing the Samaritan Flight Directive. A set of rules that protects officers who make good faith decisions to save human life, even if it means bending a procedural rule. A doctrine that prioritizes people over hardware. A doctrine that understands that a $60 million aircraft is worthless if it can't save a single life." I laid out my case. I talked about the storm. I talked about the gray areas. I argued that the true compass of the Navy shouldn't be a rule book, but the moral center of its officers. There was a long silence. Finally, the Admiral nodded. "You are asking us to codify compassion." "Yes, sir," I said. "I am." The debate in Washington took months. It was argued, dissected, and rewritten. But the tide had turned. The story of Maxwell, a man who would let his own family die to protect his record, was a stain they couldn't ignore. 6 months later, the Samaritan Flight Directive was officially adopted as United States Navy doctrine. Throughout the fleet, it became known by its unofficial name, Wood's Law. The sin that had destroyed my father's career, his compassion, was now a mandatory part of the curriculum. His de-ice grace, had become his legacy. I returned to Pensacola. I returned to my C-130. I returned to the sky. But everything was different. 1 year after that disastrous all-hands meeting, I stood in one of the main hangars at NAS Pensacola. The air was different. The fear was gone, replaced by noise. Young pilots, male and female, were gathered around a briefing table, not whispering, but openly arguing about ethics. They were dissecting a flight scenario, and I heard a young ensign challenge a senior officer. "But sir," she said, "would that be a Woods Law situation?" The culture of fear had been broken. He would be so proud, you know. I turned. Standing behind me was Anderson, my old crew chief. He was in civilian clothes, a loud Hawaiian-style shirt that was pure Florida retiree. "Chief," I smiled, giving him a hug. "I thought you were off fishing." "I was," he grunted. "Fish weren't biting. Came to see if you'd broken any more admirals." We stood there for a moment, watching the young pilots. "You did it, Lieutenant Colonel," he said, his voice thick. "You changed the whole damn thing." "No, Chief," I said, looking at the hangar. "My father did. It just took us 25 years to listen." He clapped me on the shoulder. "He'd be so proud of you, Layla." My healing didn't happen in a committee room in Washington. It happened in the air. My final checkout flight for my new role, commanding officer of the new Samaritan training program, was a routine hop. With me in the co-pilot's seat was the young ensign I'd seen in the hangar, a sharp pilot named Maria Sanchez. "Nervous, Colonel?" she asked. "Always a little," I smiled. She plotted our course. We took off, climbing into the clear afternoon light. And then I looked down. We were over the Gulf of Mexico. The water wasn't gray and churning. It was a deep, brilliant, peaceful blue. I looked at the coordinates on the navigation screen. We were flying directly over the very spot where I had defied Maxwell's order. The place where the storm had nearly torn us apart. The place where I had performed CPR in the mud. I waited for the anger, for the fear, for the memory of the cold and the humiliation. But there was nothing. Just peace. The sky was clear. I had taken my sky back. I reached into my flight suit pocket. I pulled out the old, faded photograph of my father, the one of him grinning by his F-4 Phantom. I carefully taped it to the corner of my control panel. "Who's that?" Sanchez asked. "My compass," I said. We flew in silence for a while, the hum of the engines a comforting lullaby. "Colonel," Sanchez said quietly. "Yes, Ensign." I just wanted to say, the reason I joined, the reason I'm here flying C-130s, it's because of you. I read your story. Everyone did." She looked at me, her eyes serious. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for showing us how to fly with a heart." I looked at her, this brilliant young pilot, the future of the Navy. And then I looked at my dad's picture. I smiled. "We did it, Dad." We reminded them. I placed my hand on the throttle. "All right, Ensign Sanchez," I said. "Let's take this bird home." We turned the aircraft. The C-130, the Rock, banked gracefully in the clear air, flying straight into the warm, golden light of the setting sun. It wasn't a victory. It was peace. My story ended with peace, but the journey was about finding that compass inside. My father was right. It's the only thing that guides you when all the maps are wrong. Thank you for listening to my story. If this journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of finding your strength. And for everyone who has ever had to fight for what was right, please comment below and tell us about the compass that guided you. I read every single one. You are not alone.